Hi, my name is Dr. Leila Doolittle, and I'm just going to share with you a little bit about the HPA axis and how the hormones and neurotransmitters are intricately connected and involved. And when we correct one, we have to correct the other. And it's always a vicious cycle when these are dysregulated. So the HPA axis stands for Hypothalamus-Pituitary-and-Adrenals. And this is the hypothalamus and pituitary are both glands in the brain. They're often referred to as master glands because they have such a huge control over all of the other systems in the body, the regulation of the other hormone glands, such as the thyroid, adrenals, and the reproductive organs that are all connected. And the way that they are stimulated is through that hypothalamus, pituitary, and the stimulation hormones that are released from that. So the hypothalamus sends the releasing hormones to the pituitary, and then in this way, we get the signals to the thyroid. For example, the TSH then is released from the pituitary and affects the release of the thyroid hormones, T3, T4, the conversion of T3 and T4. So we want to measure that reverse T3 as well. And then, we have a lot of other factors that play a role in that. And we won't talk about the thyroid too much because I wanted to focus more on the HPA. However, it affects everything that the adrenals do and the way that we have the awakening responses, the metabolic responses, and those other things too. So, of course, there's a lot of connections to the neurotransmitters, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail on how the thyroid affects these neurotransmitters. Now, the adrenals themselves, these are glands that control so much of our cortisol, our awakening response, the way that we feel our energy, and the stimulation of the certain hormones that really helps us with our metabolism regulation. And so what we want to do is we always want to make sure that we're taking care of the response that the brain is sending to the adrenals by circadian rhythm adaptation, circadian rhythm regulation. So what is circadian rhythm? It's when your brain and the adrenals and other glands too, but we'll focus on these two. This is when there is a period of like sleepiness and wakefulness. And it's where we release multiple different neurotransmitters and hormones that help to regulate this. For example, whenever we have light, then typically we release more of the serotonin neurotransmitter, which 90% of that's made in the gut. So of course, that's very important that we have gut health, but also that serotonin then later on is converted into our melatonin. And then that's what helps us to get into that sleep state and to be tired and to be able to, not have insomnia, have difficulty falling asleep. And this rhythm itself, yes, light does stimulate it significantly, and light dysregulation, like whether that's from jet lag from traveling to another country and then trying to, go back into your normal circadian rhythm, that can be affected. It can also be from shift work. Night shift patients that have night shift jobs are some of the most difficult because they have a really hard time trying to regulate their neurotransmitters and their hormones when every single thing about their daily lives is that their brain is thinking that it's at night and vice versa. And so the circadian rhythm itself is very hard to attenuate that. And then there can also be issues with sleep, like say sleep apnea itself. So your body is perceiving that it's not able to get the proper oxygen into the brain and into the body through sleep, then of course you're going to stay in a very unrestful sleep state because your body wants to be able to wake you up or make you move or roll over or something so that you can get your air passages open or so that you can get that oxygen into your body appropriately. So that can definitely affect the quality of sleep, and all that sends the signals back to the adrenals whether or not we're able to have that proper circadian rhythm regulation. And if we need to change that, then that's very important. Genetics also plays a big role in the adrenal response because we have certain, for example, methylation factors that MTHFR or COMT SNPs, you've probably heard of those before. It will affect how we have certain neurotransmitters that are very dependent on how our adrenals are stimulated and how the corticosteroids, these are some of the released mechanisms of how your adrenals are communicating to the rest of your body, especially to the brain too, and to the neurotransmitters. And it can also throw off GABA, one of the neurotransmitters. It's very important for you to have like anti-anxiety basically, and also going into that very nice restful state. Relaxation in the evenings, we release GABA, and then that's able to help coast us into that really nice restful night's rest throughout the system of how your body is taking into account as we're getting ready for bed, whether or not you have had high states of stress in the evenings for a long period of time, then that's whether or not your body allows you to have low cortisol, so that can be trained. Like if there's a lifestyle issue of a relationship that every time that the couple gets together in the evenings, there's bickering, there's fighting, there's something going on, and then that starts to train that high stress in to their state, or kids in the home, and one of the parents is just having a hard time with how noisy it is or how rambunctious the kids are running around, then that can also throw it off, and the cortisol starts to spike up, like right around the time of when the mother is going to pick up the kids from school and then running the kids back and forth to soccer practice and dance class and everything else. It can take a toll on these adrenal response. So lifestyle modification factors are also very important. Going back to genetics too, to touch on caffeine metabolism, genetics can actually affect how quickly your body metabolizes caffeine. So one person could have 1 cup of coffee in the morning and they don't really experience much of a change in their sleep cycles. The other one, if they have a cup of coffee after 10 o'clock a.m., then they have difficulty sleeping. So they're slow caffeine metabolizers. And that can all be measured in the epigenetics and their genetic SNPs, which show us exactly what the blueprint is and how we have to work with that. And so with these genetics as well, we want to always address how certain foods, certain nutritional factors can actually play a big role in how their genetics are expressed. So the epigenetics and nutrigenomics conversation of how are your neurotransmitters getting created and what are some of the most important building blocks that you can make sure that you're consuming in your daily diet through the phytonutrient-rich foods, the whole foods. Plants especially have the high nutrigenomics, and these genes, we are encoding them in, and that's helping to regulate our own health, our own neurotransmitters, our own hormones. And most importantly, with all of this is our microbiome. Because whenever we think about it, we have a very complex microbiome that has exponential amounts of control on our own epigenetics, but also on our digestive enzymes and the way that we're able to break down foods and the way that this microbiome keeps us healthy, keeps regulating the neurotransmitters. Whenever we say 90% of serotonin, for example, is made in the gut, well, what is it that helps make it? It's actually the processing of these probiotics of that healthy flora and the microbiome, and that helps to create this. There are actually certain types of combinations of probiotics that I'll use to help upregulate certain like patients that have, say, anxiety or depression, and they need neurotransmitter support. But instead of just giving them a neurotransmitter that makes it where their body doesn't have to create their own neurotransmitters, I don't want to take the easy route. Instead, I want to encourage their own body to help upregulate their own response to that and start creating those neurotransmitters. So I'll give them certain probiotics and then also ensure that they're eating the prebiotics to keep feeding those probiotics, because you can't just put in a capsule and assume that you're taking your probiotics and you're all good and everything's going to like fluoridate into your gut the proper way. No, we also have to feed them now. How do we feed them? Lots of important fiber, healthy fibers. There are many different types of fibers, and I'll go into that in another video because that can just get so extensive, because we want to talk about like fiber and then feeding the prebiotics and then feeding the way that your digestive enzymes are created from the probiotics and the way that they're all broken down, and then the fiber regulates the rest of the cycles. It's a whole thing. So we'll talk about that in another video. Now let's go back to talking about the adrenals a little bit more. What else throws off the adrenal function, the HPA axis function? It can be inflammation as well. So, obesinogens are very inflammatory. This is the way that we're eating. If we're not eating the proper types of foods, for us to have downregulated our immune cytokine inflammatory responses, well, then we're just feeding right into our inflammation in our body, and that's going to downregulate those corticosteroids and the way that we're releasing the stimulating factors for our cortisol, and it's going to continue to just cascade all the way down the line of events for metabolic syndrome, issues with glycemic index and the way that we're able to control our glucose and our insulin, and lead to all this dysregulation that can happen from whether or not our body is able to even process high glycemic foods anymore. Maybe we have to go onto a low glycemic index diet only, which I, of course, always go back to no processed sugars. I really try to get all my patients to stay away from processed sugars. However, fruit sugars and honey and things like that, you should be able to have some of that, and then your body should be able to process it. Now, not by itself, like if we have, say, berries and cherries and some of those other foods and fruits that are low on the glycemic index, that's great. The blueberries, that's very healthy for your brain. However, there are some other fruits that are a little bit higher on the glycemic index. Now, should we stay away from those completely? No, I don't think so. I think that for some patients, we may need to while we're trying to help balance out the response for the glycemic index and the way that the insulin is released, and the insulin helps to, like carry the glucose into the cells, and then the way that the glucose itself is processed into glucagon and the storage molecules, and then gluconeogenesis occurs as our body needs to go ahead and reabsorb some of that glucose factors and then release some of that for fuel throughout the day. Now, the way that we help attenuate that process and make it where your body can handle those little glycemic index fluctuations is by eating more fiber, with that the high glucose or high glycemic index fruits, and then also by eating some protein. So throw in some nuts and some seeds, pumpkin seeds, flax seeds, chia seeds. All of those are great ways to help with our body's processing of the factors that may throw off some of that glycemic index and may affect the adrenals, may affect the cortisol, may affect how your body is processing through those neurotransmitters. And we also want to make sure that we're thinking about certain neurotransmitters. For example, the thyroid can affect acetylcholine for memory, for our focus, for our concentration, and that's also very dependent on that glycemic index, very dependent on the way that our thyroid is communicating to the pituitary and to the hypothalamus, and for those factors, the constant communication back and forth to the brain to occur in a very healthy, regulated manner, then we're definitely going to need to be addressing the way that we have energy factors for these glands, because all glands, whenever they're creating these hormones and neurotransmitters, are going to be using a lot of energy. And so we have to regulate that energy and regulate the way that our body is controlling that. So whenever we think about how our entire system comes into play, we think about what's throwing the system off. What is it that has affected these glands in the first place? Is it high stresses? Is it the traumas that's leading to ongoing stress for the adrenals? And then therefore, we're getting into this cycle of too many adrenal corticoids, or too many of the norepinephrine, epinephrine, too much cortisol throughout the day can be very harmful. And we want to regulate stressors in our lifestyle, in our environment. We want to regulate the toxins that can be creating stress on these glands. And then we want to also regulate the internal inflammatory stressors and the other learned approaches that your system has fallen into this rhythm or this cycle, and it just needs to be retrained. We've got to make sure that we're adjusting each one of these levels. And throughout this process, we are also training our patients to really take a full lifestyle approach, not just in what things to incorporate into our diet, and to making sure that we're getting the proper sleep, how many hours of sleep, how are we handling our genetic approaches to the neurotransmitters and the hormone releases, and also what your epigenetics are telling your brain that you're constantly needing from the energy in the food that you're eating and the diet. But it's truly about every single one of these levels, each person is unique and different. We need to remove any of the toxins, the traumas, the triggers, the mediators, and then we need to help work with the blueprint of each individual patient to help all these cycles to regulate. If you found this interesting, check out my YouTube videos for more information. Check out my Instagram. I do releases there of lots of information here and there. And then also on Facebook. And all of the tags for how to find me is just Dr. Leila Doolittle. You'll find me on all of these platforms.